Hello, hello. Welcome to Forensics, the What is Life podcast, where we make the uncomfortable comfortable. I'm your host, Zafreen. Thanks for being here today. As always, these thoughts and opinions are completely my own, and you're here to hopefully hear about life and maybe just want a space to feel heard and seen. And if not, no worries too. Appreciate you being here. Now, today's topic is boundaries. Whew. I could talk about boundaries all day long, but I won't because I want these episodes to be approachable and short and sweet. And so for today, if there's anything that you walk away from, it's that boundaries work and they are possible. And I can only imagine the various emotions that the topic of boundaries can invoke. And I hope from today, you're able to walk away with something that helps you see that they can work and that they are possible. And to be honest, boundaries are how I got to where I am today. I have a much more honest and healthier relationship with my mom. I was able to remove and continue to remove negative energy from my life. I'm married on my own terms. I'm living the life that I hoped for. And I mean, the list can go on, and all of that can be contributed to or attributed to boundaries. And honestly, boundaries were one of the scariest things I ever did. And also one of the best things that I could have ever done for myself. And so, really, for today, I wanted to just talk about why boundaries are okay and that they can be really simple. And to because I can imagine for myself when, I started thinking about setting boundaries, or even my peers who are still struggling with the idea of boundaries. And it all kind of stems down to that, guess that's overwhelmed at stay of called, that we like to know as fear or guilt and doubt. And we all know homeboy needs to be given an eviction notice because we cannot grow, we can't move forward when fear holds us back, guilt holds us back, and we just want to be the best, healthiest versions of ourselves. And so I'm really hoping that today you'll be able to take some little nuggets here and there to be able to give that notice and see what feels right to you. And again, this idea of boundaries or just setting boundaries in place, they don't happen overnight. And when you set boundaries, and something that I kind of touch on in general is communication and comprehension are just not the same thing. So it's like you can communicate your boundaries all you want, but the other person on the other side may not understand what you're saying. So it's important to make sure that you are both on the same page because everyone has different perspectives looking at the same thing. And I think most importantly, boundaries only work if you're ready to make them work. And so that's something that I can 100% vouch for that statement because mine didn't start working until I was fully ready to deal with both the negative and positive consequences of setting my boundaries. So, as you can imagine, in a foreign household, boundaries don't tend to exist. And if they do, they are very one-sided. And, growing up, I had so many different things that, you aren't able to have privacy really, right? Like, growing up, I was never allowed to have like a locked bedroom. Like my bedroom door pretty much had to be open all the time. Or, you have those nosy parents that when you're on your, back in the day, we didn't have cell phones and you had to use, the home phone to talk to your friends, and your parents could just pick up the other receiver and listen in on your conversation. And you couldn't really have your own opinions and thoughts. You pretty much just had to go with the status quo and, not ruffle any feathers. And so with boundaries, I like to think of them as like, let's use the analogy of bowling, right? So most people in their life have bowled. I would hope so. Or if they haven't, then they have an idea of what bowling is. And generally, when you're first learning to bowl, you have the bumpers in place. So these little guards that are in the side of the lane that when you roll the ball down, it helps it keep it in the lane to hit the pins at the end and not necessarily go into the gutter and not hit anything. And so I like to take the analogy of bowling and kind of associate it with boundaries, where the bumpers are kind of in place in the beginning so that you can get a handle for things. And then you're able to remove them once you know how to navigate the lane on your own. And so, in bowling, right, that leads to being able to hit the pins and eventually getting those strikes. And so just thinking of bumpers in that way. And also, I mean, even just thinking about highways, when you're on major highways or on bridges, guardrails are there for a reason, and they all help us get to our destination in the end. So why did I start setting my own boundaries? And I think for myself, it's when I started noticing how I would be really upset after phone calls with my family and just feeling like I was being torn between two different places. I was battling all sorts of conflicts of, the whole idea of, wanting to be a quote unquote good daughter and being successful, being independent, not having to rely on my family to be able to, do things, as well as just not wanting to be a burden to others. I mean, the list can really go on. It's a lot. And I found that I was just burning out more, and it was really just causing a detriment to my health. Like it just wasn't helpful to anybody. And so I had moments where I started to figure out, like, why was this happening? And then what could I do to make sure that I was okay? Because it just wasn't sustainable. And I guess with this idea of boundaries, right? It's like what worked for me and what didn't. And honestly, voicing my boundaries, like literally just being very explicit about what it is that you need, which it's absolutely terrifying if it's something you've never done before. Sticking to those boundaries, no matter how difficult they were. And don't get me wrong, there were many a times where I felt like I was always getting the short end of the stick. And I felt so bad when I would have to set some of my boundaries that, it really messed with me afterwards. And because of that, it was really, really great to have some sort of support system or just a healthy vice to then lean on when I would set boundaries or I would have a tougher moment and not feel like I had to do it all alone. And for me, I mean, that's huge, right? Like, I just feel like it's just so hard for me to reach out for help. So to really find those vices, whether it's within myself or like, working out. And for me, a pivotal moment where I noticed that boundaries really worked and they were totally they work is the first time, or, when I was finally ready mentally to tell my parents that I was dating. And, as you can imagine, it's just one of those things that for me being brown, me being a girl, it's just something that's just not heard of. I mean, maybe now, nowadays it seems to be a little bit more, it can be a little bit more accepting and a little bit more of an open conversation. Whereas for me, it just felt very one-sided. It felt like, there was you pretty much just had to have an awkward conversation with your parents and then decide, that you were going to get married. And for me, life just had other plans. And so the first time when I decided to tell my parents about my now husband, Jordan, as you can imagine, it just didn't go well. I was confirming suspicions that my mom had for many years. I mean, let's be real. Moms always know what's going on, or that, you've covered all your tracks. You haven't. They always know. And when I told her, my heart was just beating out of my chest. I was just so terrified to say it, and I just blurted it out. And you can only imagine that it was just all hell broke loose. It was all these, just everything under the sun was thrown at me. And it wasn't a healthy conversation by any means. And it was then that I realized, like, I had made this conscious decision that I was going to share that I was dating somebody and that we were going to have to work to figure out how that they could accept that. And I wasn't going to just take the verbal abuse anymore. And so when my mom was pretty much just like, opening up the floodgates, like laying down the gauntlet, like I just basically said, I want to be able to have this conversation with you, and I can't if you're going to talk to me like this. And that caught my mom off guard because she was like, "Excuse me, like, what did you say to me?" And it was just one of those things of just reiterating what I said. And then realizing that I had just dropped such I had just dropped such a heavy piece of information that, of course, nobody was going to be processing it. And so we basically just hung up after that, right? Because I'd shared that, I want to be able to talk about this. I'm sharing this with you because it's important to me. And if we can't actually have a conversation, I'm not going to. And so then we didn't talk for like a week. And as many of you know, I mean, like, that's really unheard of, especially when your mom is calling you like once a day. And so I'm just going through all these different things in my mind. But that's all to be said. The next time she called, of course, same thing, heart palpitations, trying to be like, all right, what am I going to expect when I get this phone call? Guards are up, whatever. And it was just such a different conversation. Unbelievable, honestly. And this is how low the bar is that just the fact that, one, she called me back, and two, tried to have a normal conversation, and keyword try, I was just like, there is hope. And because, don't get me wrong, that conversation ended up in an argument. And again, I had to then basically end the conversation because I was like, I'm not going to talk to you if we're going to just keep arguing. It doesn't help anybody. And just over time, it just got better and better. And now we're at a place that we can actually have a conversation with each other and be honest about how we're feeling, or, to an extent, and just like feel like if something is bothering me, I can share it. If I'm getting flustered, I'll share it, and vice versa. And the other person will hear it. And one thing that I noticed that really made a huge difference is, whether you acknowledge it to that person or not, at least acknowledge it to yourself, of there's a grieving process and there is a processing process in general of that individual having to come to terms with what you shared, depending on how heavy it is. And so just allowing space and time for that to happen is so important. And there's always that fear of, you're going to lose that person, or, you're going to not be able to repair your relationship, or your relationship's going to be different after that. And that's honestly part of life. If they are meant to be in your life, if they truly love you, if they truly care about you, or if it's really important for you to make things work, then you need to see and evaluate if you're actually gaining something from that relationship. Because if you just find yourself being pulled into this negative cycle, maybe you just need space, and that could be a boundary as well. I mean, and that's something that you have to kind of think about, because boundaries have both positive and negative consequences. And it's got to be effort on both sides. It can't just be one-sided. And if it is one-sided, then maybe you should think about whether it's actually worth it or not. And I'd like to think that boundaries help you pick the weeds and keep the flowers. And so what I mean by that, right, is it just helps you tease out the healthy from the toxic. And so, if you think about a garden, weeds tend to damage your garden. They tend to not let flowers flourish. And by you taking out those weeds, you're leaving behind all the things that are healthy and beneficial for you. And so it's just really just coming to terms that when you do set those boundaries, what that means. And again, we come back to this piece of communication and comprehension. I mean, they're not the same, right? So it's like, by me sharing these things with my mom, I learned later that in her mind, she thought that I was going to completely abandon everything that I had experienced growing up. Like, all of a sudden, I had been tainted, this and that. And it wasn't until we had the conversation where I straight up was like, no, my culture is important to me. How I was raised is important to me. My, beliefs and foundations and values are all really important to me. And they, we have alignment in that. And at the same time, there are places where we have differences. And by me just sharing that, acknowledging the fears also that my mom had, I mean, we were able to come to a better place and on better terms to understand each other, that I don't think we would have been able to if I hadn't put those boundaries in place, because it would have just been that same pattern over and over again of us just, talking in circles, or her getting heightened and me just being like, sure, sure, instead of actually trying to have a conversation. And I just couldn't be more thankful just to see where I am, where our relationship is now versus where it was or how it was growing up. And so it's just really important. Just take the time to just make sure you're on the same page, because it can also just warrant a very different conversation, right? Because just understanding what her fears are, and that's why she's so upset. I think we could have like that helped mitigate so many future conversations that we would have had where I would have been defending something else and we would have just kept sticking to this pattern and cycle of arguing and talking in circles if I hadn't realized that what her actual motivations were for why she was being the way that she was on the calls, and vice versa. Now, things that didn't work for me, and I mean, I kind of talked about this, but just the idea of letting fear and guilt win, it's something that I've come to learn that people don't like change because of the fear of the unknown. And boundaries do that, right? Because there could be times where you just don't know what's going to happen on the other side of it. And it's just one of those things in life that you just kind of got to take it, right? Like you can try your best to plan. And at the same time, life has a great way of keeping us humble and things don't ever work out the way we want them to. And so letting fear and guilt win really doesn't allow you to see what works and what doesn't for you. As well as this other idea, right, of just like trying to please everyone. I mean, I think that's something of like immigrant kids is you are constantly trying to fix, you're always trying to help others. And because of that, your own well-being is put on the sidelines, and that's something that always gets cut out, always at the bottom of the priority list. And so I just found myself overextending myself, even when I knew that it wasn't going to work. I kept trying to be like, no, I can do this. I can do this. And let's be honest, that never ends well. And your body will always let you know when you are overextending yourself, even if you think that you aren't. And boundaries help protect us in that way. And this other piece of just like keeping it all to myself. I mean, we're humans. We all need interactions. We value, relationships. We aren't meant to be alone. Like we're meant to be in communities and networks. And for for us to grow, we need to have systems in place that feel like we can keep going because other items and people will hold us up. And so by leaning into those people or vices, it can really help you to keep going and keep those boundaries up. And this idea of just, keeping it all to myself. I mean, I am just notorious for this where I, don't want to burden anybody. I always want to keep, I want to handle it myself. That's how I've always had to experience it. And that works to an extent. And just recognizing, we're all human. We need interactions. We need relationships. It's just part of like how we're made up. We really value connection. And so really try your best to, if you haven't or don't already, find ways to lean into support, whether it's another actual person or, a healthy vice, something that you can essentially release everything that you're processing. I think that's a great place for us to stop for today. So this idea, right, of boundaries and setting them and what they mean to you, it's find out what works for you, figuring it out. Kind of, it's not going to be one size fits all. You're going to need to kind of try out a couple different things and then see what sticks. And, it's okay for boundaries to feel really scary. That is totally fine. Because this is a lot of times for boundaries, unless we're used to them, like the idea of bowling, right? You have those bumpers in place because you haven't figured it all out yet, that you can remove those bumpers and it'll feel less scary and when it does, then that means you might be ready to remove those bumpers. And so just the idea of, picking the weeds and keeping the flowers. And boundaries work and they are possible. And I hope that you're able to start thinking of some things, or maybe there's something from today that helped you maybe realize or want to try something. And if not, that's totally okay too. Just appreciate you being here. So yeah, with that, I hope you uh, have a great day, and just thank you so much for being here. All right.